The train let out a long, sighing whistle as it pulled away from the station, trailing behind it a swirl of dust and coal smoke. People waved from the windows. Others shouted goodbyes over the hiss of steam and the clatter of iron. But just one woman stood completely still. She was slender, maybe 30 years old, with tightly braided hair pinned beneath a small blue bonnet. Her hands were folded in front of her as if in prayer, clutching a folded handkerchief that had already absorbed more tears than it should have. Her name was Clara Wells, and the man who had just disappeared into the horizon was her whole world. He had promised to return by Christmas. The year was 1883, and the little train station in Maplewood, Pennsylvania, had only been open a handful of years. It was a modest wooden structure, just a ticket window, a single platform, and one lonely bench painted forest green. Horses tied to nearby hitching posts stamped their hooves against the chilly ground. The station master, Mr. Kinley, was inside wiping soot from the windows when he noticed Clara still standing out there, long after the train had gone. He opened the door and cleared his throat. "You all right, Miss Wells?" She blinked, nodded faintly, and whispered, "Just waiting." Clara Wells had been engaged to Thomas Birch, a traveling bookseller with dreams of opening his own printing press. He was quiet, gentle, and known for wearing threadbare coats even in summer. They met in the back of a Methodist church during a rainstorm when Clara had taken shelter under the eaves and Thomas offered her half of his apple tart. They fell in love slowly, like two pages pressed together over time. He was offered a position out west, in a Colorado town whose name Clara could never pronounce. He told her it would only be for a few months. He'd earn good money and come back in time to marry her. He kissed her hand at the train station, handed her a copy of The Tempest with a dried flower inside the pages, and said, "I'll be back before the snow settles." She smiled. She believed him. But the first letter never came. Then came weeks of silence. Then months. At first, she assumed there'd been a delay. She kept checking the post office. Her shoes grew thin from walking to town and back. Every sound of a train whistle stirred something in her chest. Eventually, someone suggested maybe he'd fallen ill. Another hinted he might have run off with someone else. A third muttered, when he thought she couldn't hear, that Thomas Birch had likely died somewhere cold and unmarked, buried under some nameless prairie sky. But Clara wouldn't hear it. She returned to the station every Thursday, the same day of the week he left. She wore the same blue bonnet. She sat on the green bench, hands neatly folded in her lap, waiting for the 10:15 train. And when the train came, and he wasn't on it, she would gather herself quietly, nod to the station master, and walk home. No tears. No breakdown. Just waiting. It wasn't long before people started to notice. A few thought she was strange. Others admired her devotion. Children whispered stories about her. One said she was a ghost. Another said she could stop time if the train ever brought him back. But Clara never acknowledged them. Her eyes stayed fixed on the tracks. She believed that a promise made beneath a clock tower, in the language of love and hope, could not simply dissolve into the air. And so she Saturday. 1 week became 2. 2 became 12. The town moved on. But Clara did not. She came every day, rain or shine. In a small brown shawl and a long grey dress that swept the dusty floor of the platform, she'd walk down to the train station with a paper parcel tucked beneath her arm. Every time, she sat on the same wooden bench just to the left of the station master's office, eyes on the tracks, as though a steel ghost might suddenly appear in the distance. The townspeople began to whisper. Some said she had been left at the altar. Others said her fiancé had died in a war. A few insisted she was simply mad, lonely and confused. But none of them truly knew. Not even the station master, who watched her come and go for decades, could ever get the full story. She only told him once, in passing, that her beloved had promised to return on that very train line. "One day," she said softly, "he'll step off that train with flowers in his hand and say he's sorry for the delay." She waited for letters, too. She'd ask the postmaster every week, always with the same question. "Anything for Miss Agnes?" And every week, the postmaster would shake his head. No letter, no telegram, nothing with her name. But she never got angry, never wept, just nodded, thanked him kindly, and turned back toward the station. In her small rented room near the tracks, she kept a little drawer locked with a ribbon. Inside were photographs, yellowed at the edges, of a young man in uniform, eyes bright, mouth half-smiling as though caught mid-laugh. There were love letters too, a handful of them, all dated from the same year. 1903, all signed by the same name, Edward. And at the bottom of each page, he had written, "Wait for me, darling. I promise I'll come back." That line, that promise, became her whole life. As the decades passed, the trains changed. Steam engines gave way to metal locomotives. The sounds were louder now, more jarring, but her gaze never wavered. She'd scan the doors, look into the crowd as they disembarked, and, for just a breath, her face would lift in hope, then fall again. She grew older. Her hair turned white. Her frame shrank beneath her shawl. But the ritual never stopped. Even the conductors began to recognize her. Some gave her a nod. Others left her alone. It was as if the entire station agreed, silently, that her vigil was sacred. Not to be mocked. Not to be interrupted. Once, a young child approached her with a flower. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked. She smiled gently and patted his head. "Yes, dear. But don't worry, he's just running late." And so the town adjusted around her. Generations came and went. Businesses changed hands. Buildings crumbled and were rebuilt. But Agnes remained. Always sitting. Always watching. Always hoping. A reporter once tried to interview her, to publish a piece in the local paper. But she declined politely. "This isn't a story," she said. "It's just love." And indeed, for her, it was. A love stretched across decades. A hope that refused to die. A belief, however irrational, that one day, one perfectly ordinary afternoon, she would look up from that bench and see the face she had been waiting for all her life. But of course, that train never came. Not with him on it. Not ever. The station workers, many of whom had come and gone over the years, now treated her like one of their own. They'd bring her tea when it rained. A few helped replace the plastic tarp she used when the summer sun burned too hot. One even offered to write to the Central Rail office to get her a more formal shelter, but she politely declined. "I'm not here to live," she explained. "I'm here to wait." The commuters, too, began to recognize her. Children who had once been frightened of the silent, still woman on the bench grew up and started offering her their candy. High school girls passed her notes folded like origami birds, telling her she was brave, or romantic, or sad. Tourists took pictures with her, some thinking she was a statue. Others left flowers, coins, or prayers on the bench beside her, unsure why. And the station guards. They knew better than to question her presence now. She wasn't loitering. She wasn't causing trouble. She was simply part of the station, like the platform numbers or the rust on the rails. A permanent fixture in a place built for people constantly coming and going. But she never came. And she never went. Even in winter, when snow turned the world into a white silence, she stayed. Wrapped in donated scarves and sweaters, a plastic sheet pulled over her boots, she'd sit with her head bowed, listening for the whistle of the train she believed would carry him back to her. And what did she do all day? She waited. She stared at the tracks like they might open and reveal a secret. She watched the people more than she watched the clock. She lived in a world between seconds, measuring time not by hours, but by the way someone's coat changed with the seasons, or how a pigeon returned to the same ledge every morning at 6:13. People started calling her the waiting woman. For some, she was a legend. For others, a ghost. But for her, she was simply a woman keeping a promise. And she believed, deeply, that if she left the station, even just once, he would arrive and find her missing. That thought alone was unbearable. So, she stayed rooted in her post like a sentry guarding a moment that hadn't happened yet. Even as her joints ached. Even as her memory blurred at the edges. Even as her name began to fade from her own lips. Because names weren't important anymore. Only one face mattered. One train. One moment. And she would be there when it came. One rainy Thursday, decades into her wait, a boy sat beside her on the bench. He was no older than 10, with crooked bangs and a backpack too big for his frame. His school uniform was damp, and his shoes squished when he shifted. He didn't say anything at first. He simply looked at her, then looked at the tracks, then looked back at her. Most children passed her by without a second glance now. She had become part of the station's background hum. like the squeal of brakes or the scratchy announcements over the loudspeaker. But this boy stayed. And finally, he asked in a whisper, "Who are you waiting for?" She didn't answer at once. It had been so long since anyone asked her that question directly. Most just assumed they knew. Or else, they didn't want to know. She turned slowly and studied the boy's eyes. He wasn't being rude. He wasn't making fun. He was genuinely curious. And so, with a voice like paper that had been folded too many times, she said, "Someone who said he'd come back." The boy looked at her hands. They were wrinkled and motionless in her lap. Her fingernails were trimmed neatly. Someone in the station must have helped her do that. She no longer bothered with mirrors or makeup. She no longer remembered how long it had been. "Did he say when?" the boy asked. She smiled faintly. "He said soon." The boy nodded solemnly, the way children do when they don't want to sound doubtful but don't quite believe you either. Then he opened his backpack and took out a small, bruised apple. "I have two," he said, offering her one. "You can have this one while you wait." She took it gently, as if afraid it might vanish. "Thank you." And for the first time in many years, she ate something slowly, not just to survive, but because it reminded her of kindness. Before leaving, the boy asked, "What's his name?" "The one you're waiting for." She hadn't spoken it aloud in years. She'd whispered it in dreams. She'd written it on napkins and watched the rain blur the ink. But saying it now, to someone listening, felt like breathing out a ghost. "Elias," she said. "His name is Elias." The boy repeated it softly. "Elias." And when he waved goodbye and disappeared into the crowd, the name stayed behind, lingering in the air like a promise still hanging in the balance. She closed her eyes and whispered it again. Not because she needed to remember, but because she wanted Elias, wherever he was, to hear it. And so, the whisper of his name became part of the station's hum too, mixed in with the arrival bells, blended with the sigh of opening doors, layered under the footsteps of thousands of strangers passing by. Elias. He was coming. She still believed. She had to. The station had become more than a place. It had become an echo. Every morning, the rhythm of footsteps, the hiss of steam, the occasional whistle of the incoming train. These sounds surrounded Blanche like old friends. And yet, within the town, people had begun to disagree about her presence. To some, she was a symbol of something noble. A portrait of faith, painted in flesh and patience. They admired her quiet devotion. They brought her sandwiches, coffee, sometimes even blankets in winter. They spoke of her as a kind of living legend, Blanche, the waiting widow, even though she'd never married. Local school children drew pictures of her for art class. Poems were written about her that made their way into the town newsletter. But to others, she was a ghost who refused to go. A living memory that disturbed the normal flow of life. Some whispered that her endless vigil was an embarrassment, that it made the town seem sad, backward, even cursed. New shopkeepers complained she scared away customers. A local preacher warned that her behavior bordered on idolatry, that her love had become obsession. And once, a new mayor proposed that the station be repurposed entirely, modernized into a grocery depot or torn down altogether. The suggestion nearly started a riot. Still, Blanche remained. Never angry, never loud. Just waiting. Some said she was mad. Others said she was holy. The truth, as always, was harder to name. She had turned down every offer to move away, to live with family, to get professional help. She wasn't harming anyone, she insisted. She paid for her meals, swept up after herself, and kept a clean appearance. The ticket master even said she was more polite than most commuters. But her presence stirred something in people, something they didn't always know how to name. Journalists came, occasionally. The first were local reporters, but soon the story reached national papers. A woman who had waited decades for a man who never came. What editor could resist a headline like that? They came with cameras, notebooks, and carefully rehearsed empathy. They asked questions like, "Don't you think it's time to move on? And what would you say to other women who feel abandoned?" Blanche would smile softly, sometimes answer, sometimes not. She never raised her voice, never gave them a dramatic quote. She wasn't looking for attention, and that made her all the more fascinating. In one rare interview, she said quietly, "I never said I was waiting for a man. I'm waiting for the moment he promised. That quote ran in newspapers across the country. And it confused everyone. What did it mean? Some said it was poetic. Some said it was a sign of delusion. But most simply didn't understand. Meanwhile, the station changed. Old wooden benches were replaced with plastic seats. The steam engines became diesel, then electric. New signs were posted. An automated voice began announcing arrivals and departures. But Blanche never seemed to change. Her clothes altered with the seasons, but her spirit remained untouched, like a leaf caught in amber. And every year on the anniversary of the day he said he'd return, she wore a dark blue dress and sat by the window seat with a single white rose. She never explained why. She didn't need to. One year, a boy asked her if she was sad. She looked out the window and replied, "No, dear. Not sad. Just sure." By then, she was part of the town's identity. Tourists came to see her. The train station was added to travel brochures. There was even talk of turning her story into a short film. But Blanche ignored the noise. She still walked the same steps every morning. Still sat in the same place. Still faced the same tracks. Not because she believed in miracles, necessarily, but because some promises don't wither with time. They take root and bloom in silence. Years passed like ghosts in a fog. By now, people were no longer just puzzled by Cesira's presence. They were captivated. Her figure had become iconic, wrapped in black shawls, posture dignified, eyes constantly searching the train tracks as though fate itself had made a promise it couldn't keep. Local shopkeepers sometimes left out warm bread or espresso on the bench beside her. Tourists came to take photographs. Children were told stories about her. Some said she was a witch who could stop time. Others said she was an angel in disguise, waiting for the lost to return. The train station staff grew old and retired. New employees came in, heard the story, and treated her with quiet reverence. Some believed she was simply mad. Others, especially those who had loved deeply and lost something inexplicable, believed every word. And Cesira, she aged too. Her hands grew more gnarled, her eyes a little dimmer, her gait more halting. But the routine never faltered. She arrived every day just after sunrise. She left just after the final train. She never asked for help, never asked to be understood. One station master, newer than most, once tried to speak to her. "Nonna," he asked gently, "why do you wait here?" Her reply was simple and soft, spoken in Italian like a prayer. "Because I promised." It wasn't madness. It wasn't obsession. It was faith, raw and impossible, stitched into every moment of her life since he had vanished. Reporters occasionally tried to extract a bigger story. She refused interviews. Someone once offered her money to dramatize her life for television. She shook her head and whispered, "You cannot buy hope." And so time passed again. A new generation of children watched her from their windows, wondering what she was doing there. Teens dared each other to sit next to her for 5 minutes. Strangers left flowers on the bench. And on the rare days she wasn't there, maybe due to illness or cold, they said the station felt different. Off. As though the platform itself had forgotten how to breathe. Even the trains seemed to pass slower on those days. It was a strange truth. Cesira, with her vigil, had become the soul of the station. Not its staff. Not the signs. Not the clocks. Just her. Some whispered that Cesira wasn't even waiting anymore. That she knew he was gone. That he had died somewhere far away, in a war, in a ditch, on a train heading in the wrong direction. But it didn't matter. She had made a vow, and she would not betray it, even if time did. Some station workers began to refer to her as La Santa del Binario, the saint of the platform. It wasn't meant to mock her. It was reverence. It happened quietly, as most endings do. One winter morning, colder than most, Cesira didn't arrive at her usual time. The sun rose slowly behind the hills, casting long shadows across the platform. The bench sat empty, unoccupied for the first time in years. At first, people assumed she was running late. It had happened once before during a snowstorm, and she'd shown up hours later, cheeks red from the wind, shawl dusted in frost. But by noon, the murmurs began. By evening, a small cluster of station workers stood near the bench, unsure of what to do. One placed a hot coffee beside the empty seat. Another checked the local hospital, just in case. But Cesira was not there. Not in the hospital. Not at home, either. Her door was found unlocked, the kettle still warm, a wool scarf left on the table like she'd meant to return in a few minutes. In her room were only two notable items, a stack of unopened letters, every one returned to sender, and a worn suitcase resting quietly beneath the bed. Inside it were three things: a pressed wedding dress, yellowing with age; a telegram, smoothed at the edges, announcing her fiancé's presumed death in a shipwreck; and a train ticket. One way. Never used. The truth finally settled in like dust on glass. Cesira had known. He wasn't coming back. He had never made it home. Not because he changed his mind or ran off with someone else, but because fate, cruel and indifferent, had stolen him. And even knowing this, even reading the telegram, she still chose to wait. Not because she expected him, but because love doesn't always need an ending to be real. The town held a small ceremony for her. There was no family to speak of. No one to claim her body. But the turnout was large, larger than anyone expected. Train staff, school teachers, former passengers, children who had grown into adults watching her wait. They all came. They didn't call it a funeral. They called it a farewell. In her honor, the mayor declared that her bench would remain untouched. A small plaque was installed beside it. It read, Cesira Bellini, 1904 to 1997. She waited with hope. She left with peace. La Santa del Binario. Years later, travelers still sat on that bench, unaware of the story. But locals would often point and tell them softly. That was her spot. They'd tell the tale like a folk legend, part ghost story, part love story, entirely true. And sometimes, on especially quiet nights, when the platform is empty and the wind moves just right, some swear they still see her there. Just for a moment. A woman in black, eyes fixed on the tracks, waiting for a train that has long since left the timetable. But not her heart. Because some hearts never stop hoping, even when the world forgets why.